Welcome back to the 10th part in this series on this content feed application, and in this one we want to pull through that image that we served in the last video in the backend Django API and serve it in the front end so that we can actually see that image in our content items. So at the moment we've got this 318 by 180 pixel placeholder image, and that's just the same image across all of the content items. So that would just be a hard-coded link, as you can see over here if you look at the source code. And what we want to do is change it to use the image link associated with that content item in the API response. So if you go and have a look at the API response, you can see the first two content items don't have an image associated with them, so they're just null. But the third one, it does actually have a link to it, and we can actually see that image in the API response. So we should be able to, instead of just hard coding this, we should be able to replace this. And I'm actually going to delete what the link is here for that placeholder image, because I want to get rid of that now that we can put an actual image in. And instead I'm going to say this.props.item, so referring to that item within the API response, and then just like we've done for the title and description, I'm just going to say .image. And so now you can see if the link is actually a valid image, then it'll render that. If it's not, then the value is null in the API response, which means that it won't show that image. It knows, okay, if that value is null, it can just skip over that part. But now that we've done that, that's like the final part of tying this whole serving static assets and pushing them through to the front end so that we can actually see them as users. So that's really good that we've got that sorted. The next thing that I want to sort out is a little bug that I found sort of to do with the responsive design of this website. So at the moment we can see that it looks quite good on desktop, but if we shrink this down, the sort of amount of space that it takes up on a mobile device is still kind of reflective of the proportions on desktop. But what I'd rather happen is when it's actually on mobile, I want it to take the full width of the screen, because this just looks a bit silly because all the content is squashed. So to fix that, I can actually change the bootstrap classes that we've got, and specifically on this is the component that we're concerned about. And instead of doing extra small 6, which is like the smallest screen width, it's going to be 6 across, I'm actually going to make that 12, and we should be able to see the effect of that when it reloads. So that's now 12, but if we increase this, it means it's still 12. So what we can do is we can actually put, okay, on the next size up, which is just going to be small in this case, I can actually say, well, I still want that one equal to 6, and then anything that's above small, so that would be medium or large as well, that's also going to maintain the last one that was set, so 6 in this case. So now if we sort of resize this and then it gets to a certain size, it's actually going to go back to the 6 out of 12 that it was taking up before. Now I think that looks a bit nicer. So the third thing that I want to do is I want to do a bit of refactoring, because well, for example, this component here, we do need this because it gives a bit of it's basically what I use to give a bit of padding to this left-hand side here. But what we don't need, because this is an empty component, there's no content within the two JSX tags here. We can actually remove some of the syntax here, so we can take out that, and that's what's called a self-closing component. It just means, okay, well, I'm going to assume that you want me to render an empty component, so you don't actually need to close the component explicitly because it already knows to do that. So I think that looks a bit nicer, and so it's still rendering just as we'd expect. But what we can actually do is, because this is what's called a stateless component, meaning that it doesn't have any state associated with it like we do in this component up here, it means we can actually refactor this so that it's a lot simpler. And the way that I'm going to simplify this is by using what's called a pure stateless function. And what that basically means is I can rewrite this class in such a way that I need a little bit less code to do that. So instead of having the content item component defined as a class, what I'm going to write instead is I'm going to say const and then the component name. So I'm effectively rewriting the content item component now, and I'm going to say for now that it doesn't take anything, but what it's going to do is it's going to return and then this is just going to be the value that we return, which is in this case all of this JSX. So we can actually paste that in, and my indentation is slightly off, so I can correct that, and that looks a little nicer. Now what I can do to deal with the props in this case is I can say, well, I want to use the prop item, and I'm being very explicit about that in this case, because we're rewriting it such that we have a component which only deals with the props. We can actually be explicit and say, I want the item prop to be passed into this component, and then actually you don't even need to say this.props, because you can just say item and then it'll know, because that's in within the scope of this function. So I can get rid of this as well, and now I think that's quite a bit simpler than we had before. There's just a bit less code. There's no need to define a render method, because it assumes that the return value of this anonymous function here is actually the return value for the render. So what we can do now is we can delete this, and I think that's a little bit simpler. So let's go back to the application and just check that it works. So now let's refresh. You can see that it's just working as before, and components are rendering, and we fixed the sort of mobile layout issues. You should now have a working content feed application which you can add content to, upload images, and see the results of those content items within your React front end. But these skills that you've learned with React and building that backend API using the Django REST framework, these skills can really be applied to any web application that is API driven that you want to be able to create.